everyone. So we're going to get started now. So just to briefly go through some ground rules before we begin. So we're starting now, and we have Golvine today who's going to talk for about 45 minutes. And if you have any questions during the main body of her presentation, can you please use the Q&A function just for clarifying questions? Can I mention then for any panelists, if you can use the raise your hand function, and then I'll call on you during a convenient, I'll either call on the panelists or I'll read out the questions from the Q&A if important during the presentation. Then at the end, we'll have 13 minutes where we can have more of a discussion. And if you want to ask a question, you'll be called on to ask it directly to Golvine. Again, use the raise your hand function during this Q&A time, and we'll call on you directly. So thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to welcome Golvine de Rochambeau from Sciences Po, who's going to be presenting today on deviations from the law of one price, what commodity prices reveal about international trade costs. So I'll give the floor to you, Golvine. We're really excited to have you.
Okay, so let me share my screen to begin with. Can you guys see my screen correctly? Yes? Okay, great. So let me start. All right. So this is a very new project. So any ideas, comments, questions you may have, please feel free to ask or mention. Let me just dive right in. Let me start with a statistic. More than 90% of the world's population does not live in a capital city. The point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of people live in a city that is not the door to the outside world of the country, or in other words, that they're not directly linked to international markets. With the caveat, of course, that capital cities are not always the port of entry or the export hub of the country, but still, so the broader point I'm trying to make is that when we think about economic development, understanding intra-national transportation and the international transportation sector is key. In fact, the literature has already looked at that and has shown that international transportation infrastructure matters a lot, that railroads, bridges, roads impact households' decision-making, such as, for example, households' occupations or, sorry, households' ability to hedge against risk or investments decisions. In this paper, I'm not so much going to look at household decisions rather than market equilibria, and in particular, I'm going to look at how exactly do people trade, or in other words, what does the market for traders look like? We know that there are frictions on the market for trading goods, that this is not a frictionless market, and for example, that there are contracting problems with intermediaries, or that there are information frictions which prevents traders from knowing prices exactly everywhere on the market, and so that this creates frictions on the market for trading goods. In this paper, what I'm going to be focusing on is the particular role of micro traders in intranational transportation. What I mean by what I will be calling micro traders are small-scale individual traders who coexist with large trading companies who typically trade with, say, container trucks, right? Like shipping in bulk. These small-scale individual traders, they're going to carry around smaller quantities of goods. They're usually going to transport their goods through systems such as motorcycles or car taxis, or even sometimes hitchhiking on trucks. And these small-scale traders, very often, actually, trading is not going to be their main source of income. They're going to do it just as something to complement their source of income. So, for example, what I have in mind is a worker who is in the countryside, who is commuting to the city for work. Then when he's going from the countryside to the city, he's bringing with himself a bag of rice and carrying this bag of rice from one market to another, then he would be considered a micro trader. So exactly how am I going to do this? Well, I'm running into directly a measurement challenge because there is very little data on transportation at the market level. In fact, in many markets, we're going to have data on prices, maybe sometimes on the origin of goods. And again, that's very rare, although we have it now for more and more countries, but we don't have transportation data. We don't know through what means the goods have been transported to the destination markets. And even if we had this data for a couple of markets, it wouldn't be comparable across countries. So the way I'm going to go around this issue is to actually use within country price differences as a measure of trade costs. Now, of course, I'm not the first one to actually use within country price differences as a measure of trade costs, and this has already been done in the literature. So first of all, I'm going to show you that the patterns I have in my data are consistent with what people have found in the literature on within country price differences, or in other words, price dispersion. And after I do that, I'm going to evaluate the effect of movement restrictions imposed on these micro traders, with the idea that if restricting the movement of micro traders has a significant impact on price dispersion or within country price differences, then it means that these micro traders play a significant role in within country transportation. So what movement restrictions am I talking about? Well, as many of you know, during the coronavirus crisis, a lot of governments actually imposed these movement restrictions, otherwise known as stay-at-home requirements or lockdowns, which restricted the movement of people within the countries. Importantly, because many countries were worried about food security during the crisis, in many cases, these restrictions actually concerned the movement of persons, but not the movement of goods. Meaning that the argument I'm going to try to make is that these restrictions didn't change much the operations of the big trucking companies that were shipping containers from one point to another. However, it disrupted the movement of persons, and by disrupting the movement of persons, it did change the movement of goods, particularly in places that rely on the movement of persons to actually trade goods, right? And so here, again, what I have in mind are these micro traders, or what I call the micro traders, and I'm going to show that these restrictions actually disrupted the commodity trading, particularly in places where micro traders are or should be present. Okay, so let me tell you how the talk is going to go approximately. So first, I'm going to tell you a bit about what I mean by price differences and what we're usually capturing when we're mentioning price differences. Then I'll show you the data that I'll be using, and then I'll dive in the empirical results with, first of all, the patterns and how these patterns actually reflect what has already been shown in the literature and the fact that I find more or less the same results. And then I'll show you the effect of travel restrictions on these price differences. Okay, so a little bit of methodology to begin. So imagine a trader that is trading goods from an origin to a destination. Then what does the price of the commodity at destination reflect? Well, it's the price at origin, right? The price at which the good was bought, plus the transportation, so the marginal cost of transporting a unit of the commodity between the origin and the destination, and a markup. Here I'm going to be very vague. It doesn't really matter for the exercise I'm going to do today what exactly is in this tau, this marginal cost of transporting, and the mu, the markup of the trader. However, just to set ideas, for example, what I have in mind are that tau OD will be fuel costs, for example, right? The fact that you need to pay fuel to go from one point to another, or you know, repairs for the trucks or these types of things, or for the cars, or whatever means you're using. Plus mu is the markup, whatever money someone has made during the chain between the origin and the destination, right? So here I'm encapsulating in this like trader name everyone that is between the origin and the destination. And so what do the markups contain? Well, the markups are going to depend on a lot of different things, but typically we think of them as depending on the demand for the good at destination, meaning that if the destination is a place where there is a high demand for the good, then the prices will be able to charge a higher price, and so markups might increase, but also the competitiveness of the transport sector between the origin and the destination. And here, this is going to be key in my analysis, because the more traders they are on a certain road or within a certain country, then the lower the markups. And so the closer the destination price will be to the origin price. Okay, so let me just rewrite this in a more convenient way, which is the price difference, which is exactly what I'm going to be looking at, which is now this marginal cost plus this markup, which depends on two things: the demand for the good and the competition on the axis between the origin and the destination. Now, what do we expect about these price differences? Well, typically from the literature, we're going to expect these price differences to depend on telecommunications. And the example that I have in mind here is what Trebalen shows in his papers, in his 2018 paper, which is that if telecommunications are well developed, then traders are better aware of the prices of goods in other markets. And so if telecommunications, if you're in a place where telecommunications are well developed, then the price dispersion is lower, or in other words, the price difference between the destination and the origins are going to be lower. You could also argue that the telecommunications make consumers more aware of the goods, which might actually shift demand. But on average, what we find in the literature is that telecommunication decrease price dispersion rather than the opposite. Okay, and then the second thing that we expect is that infrastructure actually matters for price dispersion. So here, and there are many examples of this, but a known example of this is Dave Donaldson's paper on the introduction of railroads in India, where he shows that actually the introduction of infrastructure allowed markets to be connected, and this worked on two angles, right? First, it decreased the transportation cost, meaning it became less costly. So the tau OD actually decreased between the origin and the destination. So it became less costly to ship goods from one point to another, but it could also play a role through the competition, because by improving infrastructure, you're also allowing new players to come into the market and to actually compete to trade goods between the origin and the destination. And so for this example, here, if you're thinking about the introduction of railroads, of course, trains are an entirely new way of transporting goods. But to another extent, even when you're building a road, for example, if you're paving a road, then you might be making markets accessible via truck, whereas before they were only accessible via motorcycles or cars, right? So here, there's this idea that with the infrastructure, you're increasing the competition, and you might be increasing the competition that micro traders are facing on these routes. And the last thing that I will mention that is supposed to change the price differences is the movement of people. And here, this is what I'm going to try to argue in this paper. The movement of people between origin and destination is going to offer more opportunities for goods to be traded between the origin and the destination. And so the more people move between the origin and the destination, the lower the price dispersion.
Golvine, can I just jump in there? So there's
Sure,
a question
absolutely.
from Carol.
Hi, Golvine. So I'm just wondering, in the introduction, you made a distinction between micro and large-scale transportation. So I guess this price differential could also be affected by the scale of the transportation, I don't know, person or company, right? So should we think about these traders being homogeneous in your application, or what is it here?
No, so actually, no, to the extent that in the application that I'm going to be looking at, right, the introduction of movement restrictions with the coronavirus crisis, this affected, I'm going to argue that this affected more the small scale traders than it affected the big scale traders. And so to that extent, I don't believe that movement restrictions stopped entirely the trade between two markets. It only stopped the trade for a certain type of traders, or particularly for a certain type of traders, right? So you don't, so in a way, I'm not gonna assume that all of them are the same. And here in this particular slide, I'm including all of this into the competition angle of the markup, right? So I'm being a bit abstract here. I'm not making any assumptions.
Okay, thank you.
And here again, I'm not gonna assume that the restrictions, the movement restrictions imposed by during the coronavirus crisis, today I'm not gonna impose anything on whether they restricted completely the micro traders or not, or I'm just gonna say, like, the more the micro traders there were, the more these chains are going to be disrupted. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about the data I have and that I'll be looking at and using for this paper. So the price data I'm using is actually being aggregated by the World Food Programme, and it's commodity prices. So at the market level, very interestingly. And so what the World Food Programme does is basically all of the statistical agencies of the different countries gather data, commodity prices data, and then they share it through to the World Food Programme, who then aggregates the data and shares it. So the World Food Programme, importantly, does not itself collect these commodity prices data. I'm using data that is being collected by the local statistical agencies that is then being aggregated by the World Food Programme. So typically these statistical agencies, they would gather data for, say, CPI data. And this is exactly the data that they share with the with WFP. Now, it's not, so I've compared this actually with Niklas, we've compared this slightly with the CPI data in Ethiopia, and it's not exactly the CPI data. It's a bit less discrete. It's a bit, you know, it's kind of like aggregated. It doesn't have all of the markets or all of the commodities, but still it contains data that is typically used for calculating CPI. And so because the World Food Programme cares about food security, most of these commodities are going to include goods that are consumed by local households, such as staple foods, right? So the one thing that appears the most is millet, then rice, then maize. Okay, and so these are commodities that appear very often at the country level. Now, also importantly, because these commodities are not being, or these prices are not being collected by the same entity in the different countries, the commodities are not comparable between countries. So I'm only going to compare commodities within a country. So for example, I'm going to compare the price of rice in different markets within the country. So when I talk about price differences in my talk, I talk about market level differences within the country, and not comparing markets across countries. Okay, and finally, I have the commodity prices at the market level on a monthly basis. So, right, so everything is aggregated at the month level. Okay, what about the sample? So the World Food Programme aggregates data from about 100 countries, but from these 100 countries, I cannot use all of the countries for my analysis. I actually have to keep countries that report data for more than one market, right? Because I'm going to look at price differences. I can only keep countries that report more than one market so that I'm able to compute these price differences. But also I'm going to be looking at price changes, and so I need commodities that are being reported for a certain period of time. Okay, so because already you can sense that there is some selection on commodities, some selection on market, particularly at the country level. So I'm going to have to put country fixed effect, or sorry, commodity fixed effects and market fixed effects. And so because I do that, I need commodities to be reported for a certain period of time. And so I'm going to require commodities to be both reported in 2017 and in 2020. And so that leaves me with a sample of 63 countries, which is quite a lot, given that I'm looking at intra-national transportation. On average per country, I have a little less than 30 commodities. I have about 40 markets per country, but of course there's a lot of variation from country to country. And before I have any questions on this, I could drop the countries for whom I don't have a lot of commodities or for whom I don't have a lot of markets. The results are basically unchanged. So this, of course, I don't observe all of the commodities in all of the markets. Sometimes because the country, statistical agency has decided to not collect all of the commodities in all markets, but also because sometimes commodities are not available in certain markets. And so I'm not going to have a full panel data set, but I'm going to have about 300, on average, 300 monthly price observations per country. Okay, so here to give you an idea, here is a map of the countries that I have in my sample. So the main takeaway of this map is that there's a lot of different countries in my sample. I have both, so I have Asian countries, I have Middle Eastern countries, I have Latin American countries, I mean, a few Latin American countries, but interestingly, I have a lot of African countries, which allows me to test the theory not only on the entire globe, but also restricting it at Africa. And the results are unchanged if I actually focus on Africa as for the sample. But also on the regressions that I'm going to show you, when I can, I'm going to include continent fixed effects. Okay, so I think there's a question in the Q&A, Emma, but if not, I can go through the empirical results.
Yes, no, sorry if that's disturbing you. There is a question in the Q&A. So from Ola Bode Olafin, he asks, can't more movement of people increase the demand for transport and thereby cause transport costs to rise? So I think this was back when you were going through the model.
Right. So that's true. So it's the so in a way it could be. It could be, although so I don't know empirically whether that's the case or not. I would have to check. But in a sense, it doesn't put into question the results that I'm going to present, because the results are going to go the opposite way, right? So if anything, I'll be underestimating the effect if that's the case. However, that's an interesting point, and it's definitely something that I can check.
There's actually another question as well in the Q&A, so maybe this makes sense to ask this now as well, from Tilman von Carnap. So on the products in the sample, he says, I guess that the vast majority of at least the grains are transported in bulk, given that they have a low ratio of weight to value. For micro traders, wouldn't they specialize in goods that have a higher value per unit of weight if they don't transport this with their own vehicles?
So that might be true, although my understanding of micro traders is that often they do micro trade because they have a link with that particular commodity. So so they might be just trading because they know that some commodities are sold for a higher price in other markets, and so they're just benefiting from that. But in other cases, it would be like, for example, if they have local production, then they're going to take their own rice that they're going to sell somewhere, right? Even though it's small production. So it's interesting, although, so again, that's definitely something that I can check, whether there is heterogeneity with respect to like weight per price units or something like that. And that's something that I actually have in the data, so I can definitely check. Thank you for the suggestion.
And then there's also a hand up from Giulio.
Hi, thanks. Just a quick clarifying question. With at what level are you measuring commodities? Because for some of the staple goods, if I'm not mistaken, there is different qualities of the same staple goods. So for example, rice, you got imported rice and local rice. So how are you measuring that?
Interesting point. So so again, this is measured by the statistical agency. So there's going to be obviously heterogeneity at the country level. Although I expected, so most of the statistical agencies, at least the ones I know or that I've heard about, are all collecting data, which is at the brand level, if there is a brand, or at the type level, right? So for imported rice, for example, in the countries that I know, they'll look for a particular brand and look for that brand and calculate the price. And then, and for a certain quantity, right? It's always the same quantity. And then they'll also report local rice, but then local rice is a bit broad, right? So, I mean, there's no direct way of, like, there's no brand for the local rice. So then they'll just say local rice. However, so there's that limit, right? And again, here we're talking about staple foods. So a lot of these are going to be locally produced. And so there are no brands that you can refer to in many cases. But so I expect this to create noise because I'm looking at price differences, right? But I don't think it will bias my results. If you have an idea of like how this would bias the results, I'm interested to learn. Maybe you can tell me by the end of the presentation if you think that biases the results.
I wasn't sure. Yeah, we can chat about it later. I wasn't sure if we bias anything. I just wanted to.
No, sure.
It's just a clarifying.
In general, I'm interested to know whether that, whether there's a bias or not. All right, so let me show you. So first, what I'm going to show you in the empirical results are how this relates to the literature and whether it's consistent with how the price differences or the price dispersion changes with telecommunications and with infrastructure. And then I'll move on to show you the effect of travel restrictions on price differences. Okay, so first of all, let me show you how I compute this and how I look at the effect or how I look at price differences. So basically, I could do raw price differences, but there's a bunch of problems with that. And in particular, there's a lot of, so if I look at every pair of markets in my data and all of the price differences that creates, it really creates hundreds of millions of observations. And so I'm going to group this into at the country month level. Okay, and I do this, of course, because it's easier for me to deal with this data, but also because then the results are not biased because some countries report more markets or more commodities than others. And so here, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to calculate the average price difference over market pairs, over commodities, by country, by month. Okay, so I'm going to, in the final data set that I'm going to have one observation per month per country. Okay, although I start with hundreds of millions of observations, which are all of the pairs of markets. So within a pair of market, how do I define the origin? Well, again, here, I don't have systematically for all of the commodities in my database, I don't have the precise origin of the good. So I'm just going to take the minimum price as the origin, the price at origin of the good, right? Which means that, so the idea behind this is that if you look at a price pair, right? If you look at two prices, if one price is lower, it's probably that it's in the market which is closer to the production area than the other price. And so this is what I'm capturing. Again, here, I know that there's literature to show that this is not exact, but if anything, I'll be underestimating the price differences between origin and destination, or at least if you believe Atkin and Donaldson's method. And again, here, I don't think this will bias the results in one way or another. The other thing I'm going to do is that to be able to compare prices across commodities and across countries, I'm going to divide prices by 2017 prices. And so that's why I need 2017 prices. I'm also going to detrend them because prices in general, particularly staple foods, are on a trend. And I'm going to Winsorize it at the 1% level, although I could do it at the 5% level and this wouldn't change anything. And finally, I'm going to, in order to be able to aggregate this over market pairs, because market pairs might be very different, I'm going to try to to make them as comparable as possible. And so I divide the price differences by the distance. And so here, the way you can interpret the price differences YCT is by thinking of them as the percentage increase per kilometer of road between two prices on average in the country. Okay, so this makes YCT very much interpretable and understandable. Rosa, you raised your hand.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so you're averaging across these commodities, and I presume that's because the commodities are similar enough that they're similar in terms of how tradable they are and how perishable they are.
So not all. So that's a good point. And yeah, so they're not. And here I'm kind of abstracting away from this. I'm trying to abstract away from these issues by thinking of them as price differences and not price levels, right? And so, but you're right that there might be very different effects on, for example, perishables or not, stockables or not, that kind of things, or even exported and imported. That's not data that I currently have at the commodity level, at the country level, but it's definitely something that I plan on merging to the data in the future.
So just on that, like, if you are worried about there being differences between different countries in the commodity groups that you have, could you control for that in some way?
So I can, so controlling for it is kind of hard because then you would need to like create an index for how perishable a good is or how exported a good is. But what I could do is try to compute the different price differences for perishables and non-perishables and see whether the effect is different or see whether price differences are different, right? Yeah, it might be, so, right, so yeah, I mean, that's definitely an interesting exercise and I haven't done it so far. And it's not that complicated. I mean, perishables you see pretty quickly, right? And exporting, importing you with like trade data, you can know relatively easily which goods are imported, which commodities are mainly imported and which are not. Sometimes it's even in the commodity, right? Like as I was talking before, the rice, sometimes it's like imported rice, so you know that it's imported. Okay, so what should we expect? So, sorry, Verena, you had a question before I move on.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question. How are you dealing with gaps in your data and especially like missing values?
So I'm abstracting away from it in that when I compute the averages, I'm going to compute the averages for the commodities that I have. I've tried to do several things around this, like creating a full panel data set for the data for, you know, keeping the same commodities over time. It doesn't change much. I've also looked at whether, and so this is more about the travel restrictions, about how the crisis has changed the availability of goods in certain places. However, that's not very clear. I mean, the results are not super clear because in some cases, availability has definitely gone down. In other places, I actually see more prices being collected. And to the best of my understanding, this comes from the fact that some countries, when the crisis arrived, were very worried about food security and starting putting a lot of effort to collect market prices for certain commodities. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't systematically go, decrease or increase, but it definitely depends on certain countries.
Do you see some heterogeneity in terms of bigger and smaller markets, just from like experience working with price data, that sort of gaps tend to occur more frequently, obviously, in smaller markets, sometimes because the goods are not available, but also sometimes because the statistical bureaus don't put as much effort into collecting of data in those markets and how sort of that affects the results.
Yeah. I agree. And so I haven't been able to catch any interesting heterogeneity there that I could talk about, or that struck me as like an interesting finding, or what I thought at the beginning was that, if abstracting away from like the statistical agency's problem of collecting the price data, a good was not available if it was too expensive for the market, right? So in a way, when you're looking at price differences of prices that you do have in your data, you're kind of like underestimating the price gap. And in a way, it would be interesting to know, but to what extent, right? So you would like to know, like, what is the maximum price at which they can trade the good? But that I haven't managed to know how to tackle that issue.
Mm. Can you like also? I think it's a bit related. Sorry if I'm taking up. But can you also control for how sort of big the markets are? Because I feel, at least like from comparing, let's say Kenya and Ethiopia, the Ethiopian sort of statistical agency goes into really small markets at times, versus the Kenyan KNBS, they just really go into a few super large cities, and you obviously see large distances, but these are, you know, very big markets, and so sort of you see the distance variation, but they're quite the setup of prices that you see in Kenya. I presume you would see in Kenya as opposed to Ethiopia, just the countries where I know the approaches of the statistical agencies is completely different in the setup or in the makeup of the market.
Definitely. And I'm going to put country fixed effects whenever I can, exactly for that reason, to like kind of capture the statistical agency's willingness to collect prices. One thing that I could do actually is, you know, like, for example, I have very big countries for which I have very few observations. And then I have Burundi. For some reason, they collected tons of commodity prices. And so for sure, these markets are like smaller and closer together. And so they're going to have different. So I could try to look at that, which I haven't done systematically. Definitely. That's an interesting point. And yeah, or like population census data, that kind of thing. I haven't thought of that. Thank you.
Can I just say you have about 10 minutes before we'll move to the Q&A?
Okay, so I'm going to speed up. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so what we should expect? Well, we should expect price dispersion to depend on infrastructure, with the idea that with better infrastructure, there's more traders, easier to trade. And so better infrastructure means lower price differences. But also, we expect price differences to depend on telecommunications, with the idea that better telecommunications means lower frictions of information frictions on the market. And so better telecommunications probably means lower price differences or lower price dispersion. So this table just shows you pure correlations to just confirm what the literature has found in this area. And indeed, what I find is that countries with better road quality and availability are the countries that have lower price differences. And the countries that have a higher share of mobile ownership in their population are the countries where the price differences are lower. Okay, and so just in order to give you an idea of how to interpret this, so here I've put in most of my tables the effect of one standard deviation as a percentage of output. So this means that one deviation change in road, or one standard deviation increase in road quality and availability index decreases price differences by about 14%. Okay, so this confirms what the literature has been finding, which is I'm relieved given the data I have. And so now I'm going to include travel restrictions. So as you know, in 2020, a lot of countries introduced these COVID restrictions, or these movement restrictions. Now, there are many reasons why the crisis might have affected the price levels in one way or another, or the price availability. Here, I'm going to try to abstract from that by looking at the price differences. Okay, and so I'm going to argue that the travel restrictions really changed price differences, or the COVID crisis really affected price differences through its effects on travel restrictions. The way I'm going to measure travel restrictions is actually using the Oxford database, which is very complete, on the COVID policy tracker. And the particular index I'm going to use are the different levels of restrictions of movements of goods. And this index goes from 0 to 3, 0 being no measures at all, and then 1 a recommendation, 2 a requirement to stay at home a bit strict, and then 3 a requirement to stay at home even stricter. And so in all of the analysis, I'm going to keep this index from 0 to 3, although if I put in a dummy for any restrictions, the results are very much comparable. And in the rest of the paper, I'm going to drop China for a lot of reasons, but also because China might have reacted differently to the COVID crisis than other countries. So I'm just going to drop it, although again, I can keep it and it doesn't change much the results. So the regression I'm going to run is going to be a simple difference in difference with, the price difference, country fixed effects, time fixed effects, and this restriction index, which goes from 0 to 3. So for this to be correctly specified, I need the timing of the restrictions to be assumed exogenous. Is that the case? Can I actually claim that the restrictions were exogenous? Well, indeed, the timing of the restrictions does not correlate with pre-crisis difference. What does correlate slightly, and here, I have 60 countries, so it's not easy to find these restrictions, and the coefficients are really small. However, there's a slight correlation of whether there are any restrictions at all with pre-crisis price differences. And so so there were only 3 countries, so from my slide before, there are only 3 countries that did not impose any measures of movement restrictions. And so in the rest of the analysis, I'm actually going to drop these 3 countries of the analysis just to show you that the results are not biased. Okay, and again, here I need to be very careful on how I deal with these price differences or these average price differences, because some of my identification is going to come from a before and after comparison. I need to make sure that there is no trends, right? If you're an upward trend and you're doing a before-after comparison, then you are comparing 2 different means that are just due to the trend. So I'm going to detrend the price averages. I'm going to capture the fact that some markets might be missing or some commodities might be missing. I'm going to add market pair fixed effects and I'm going to demean at the market pair and commodity level while computing or before computing this YCT average. And finally, I'm going to control for the seasonality. So again, when I'm going to compute these aggregate price differences, I'm going to demean by month of the year, meaning by January, February, etc., to try to capture the seasonality in prices within the country. And of course, this demeaning of prices is done at the country level because I expect these 3 effects to have an effect at the country level. So I do it at the country level. Okay, and so here are the results. And again, sorry, to come back to all of the specifications I do on the data, so they change a little bit the estimate, but the results hold whether I keep one, put the other. It's not that really leads the results. And so here are the main results. So the output here are within country price differences, and I regress that on the stay-at-home requirements. The results of the equation that I just showed you are in the 3rd column here. And so just to interpret these results, I've computed the pre-crisis average price difference. This means that on average, globally, before the crisis, prices increased by about 6.7% per 100 kilometers of road. Now, the average stay-at-home requirement index takes a value of 1.87, which multiplied by the coefficient is 0.68, which compared to 6.69 represents about a 10% value. This means that imposing stay-at-home requirements actually increased the price differences globally by 10%. Okay, which is relatively big and important. And then in the 4th column, instead of putting country fixed effects, I actually add continent and I control for GDP, and I arrive at an estimate that is very close to the estimate I have by adding country fixed effect, which shows that GDP is really the thing that is triggering these differences across countries. Okay, just a robustness here. So you've seen that the index can take the value 1 or 2 or 3, whether it's a recommendation, a requirement, or a strict requirement. And so what I see here is that most of the effect comes from the levels 2 and 3 of the requirements, which makes sense because if it's only a recommendation, probably these micro traders are still going to trade, even though the stay-at-home requirements have been imposed. And then the other check that I do is that this actually comes from the stay-at-home requirements and not other policies that were put in place because of COVID. And so here I'm going to use the timing of the restrictions and the fact that in many countries, instead of directly imposing stay-at-home requirements, a lot of countries actually started imposing international travel restrictions before they started imposing stay-at-home requirements. And so when I do that, I see that the effect remains for stay-at-home requirements, but also that the coefficient for international travel restrictions is actually relatively small, which is reassuring given the story I've been telling you so far. Okay, and finally, in the last 4 or 5 minutes that I have, I'm going to show you how these travel restrictions affected different countries differently. The idea here is that on average, we've seen that overall price differences seem to increase by about 10%. And the mechanism I'm trying to tell you is that these movement restrictions affected the micro traders. So we expect these movement restrictions to be stronger in places where micro traders are have a more important place. So what are the places that have a high proportion of micro traders? Well, of course, we don't know that. So I'm going to try to look at 2 aspects for which I think are going to matter for signaling something on the share of micro traders. So first of all, I'm going to look at places that have high level of trade costs to begin with. So these are places that before the crisis, so before 2020, already had high price differences. And the idea is to say, well, if price differences are high, this signals a lot of things that might be correlated with the fact that micro traders might trade more on that route. The second thing is that we might expect micro traders to have a higher share in the places that have low levels of infrastructure. And the idea here that I have in mind is that, for example, if a road is not paved, then only motorcycles can get through. And so you need a lot of motorcycles to go back and forth. And these are exactly the places that you would expect will develop a higher share of micro traders. And so from this, what I expect is that the effect of restrictions on price differences should be stronger in places that have high levels of trade costs to begin with and low levels of road infrastructure. And when I take this to the data, this is exactly what I find. So the interesting line here is the second one, and basically it shows that the effect of stay-at-home requirements increases with pre-crisis price differences. Okay, now the first coefficient, the first line of coefficient here is negative, but we shouldn't be worried about the fact that it's negative because it doesn't actually have much support, right? And so to see this in the second part of the table here, I've computed the average effect of restrictions for below median pre-crisis price differences, which is close to 0. And then the effect of the average restrictions for above median pre-crisis price differences, which is about 20%. This means that if I take the countries and I divide them in 2 groups, those that have high price differences and those that have low price differences, the group of countries for which I have low price differences doesn't see any effect of travel restrictions. However, the countries that had already high price differences actually see an increase even more after of their price differences with the travel restrictions. So this small summary that I just told you just shows you that indeed the inequality across countries in terms of price differences increased with the crisis. And the second table here shows you exactly the same thing, which is that, but with respect to the road quality index, which is that the better road quality and availability, the lower the stay-at-home requirements had, the lower the effect of stay-at-home requirements on within country price differences. Okay, and so here you can see this from the negative coefficients here, and in terms of magnitude, this seems to be less significant than pre-crisis price differences, but still very much significant. And I think I'm almost out of time, so I'll conclude now. So just to summarize the results, I've shown that restrictions that were aimed at reducing people's movement within country actually increased trade costs as measured by price differences, and that this effect is particularly strong in places that are thought to have a high share of micro traders. And so I take this for evidence that the micro traders exist, that they're a thing, but also that the micro traders play a significant role in intra-national transportation, particularly in places that do not have the infrastructure or that do not have low price differences to begin with. Now, what does that mean more broadly for policy? Well, first of all, it means that restricting the movement of micro traders, as was done during the coronavirus crisis, will have a direct impact on prices faced by isolated markets. So we should be careful about these types of policies, although I hope that these restrictions will not be implemented in the near future other than for this particular crisis. But also more broadly, it means that any policy that is aimed at improving within country trade should take into account the fact that there are these micro traders that are doing the back and forth between the countries, between the markets, and that for whom this is a complement to their income, and they're not the typical traders that we have in mind when we think about within country trade. Okay, and that's it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Golvine, for that fantastic presentation. So yeah, we now have about sort of 6 or 7 minutes for questions and more general discussion. So whoever wants to go first with a question, I can see Rossa has a hand up. So Rossa.
Thanks so much, Golvine. This is really interesting. The thing that strikes me most is there seems to be a huge amount of heterogeneity across countries. And this is just comparing like an above median and below median comparison of countries on their trade costs before the COVID crisis. And this suggests to me that like within countries, there's going to be even more heterogeneity, which might be really interesting. And then I was wondering, so you mentioned Burundi has lots of data. Can you do anything within country to try and see, like, are there places that are really isolated where you get like a 40% increase in prices or something like that? Because that seems really important here.
Yeah, I wish I could. So I thought I started this project thinking about that, right? Like about how within country, I mean, how that can tell us something about within country trade. But it's really hard. So systematically, I don't have data on within country. It's much harder to get. So, I mean, there are a few countries for which I have lots of markets. And so right now I'm kind of, you know, aggregating this at the market, at the country level, which is a bit frustrating because we could use these differences. But so, for example, for the particular exercise that I'm doing today, I'm using COVID restrictions. That data doesn't exist at the subnational level for countries that I have in my data, right? It exists for the US, for the UK, I think, but I mean, I haven't seen it yet for like within country. So I don't know whether, you know, like if at the national level, these like restrictions were put in place in some in some parts of the developing countries and not others, which I would need to do such an identification, right? The other thing that I've done is just check a before and after for countries, right? Because that I can do, and I see which countries actually increase or decrease the prices. Julien, you have a, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so just to plug, I think the latest version of the COVID tracker has data for Brazil at the subnational level. So now
Yeah,
Brazil, you don't
I
have
Brazil.
I have Brazil.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think kind of pushing on the same line as Rosa, I think it would be useful, even if you take like a couple of countries and show that in markets that are a bit more segregated, you could, and I mean, I think the Philippines is one of your countries, and kind of being a country with so many islands, I'm guessing it's going to be kind of even more affected by those restrictions. So that could be an easy way for you to check whether in that particular place that the effect is stronger.
No, definitely, and so. The other thing I would like to do is actually, you know, kind of build a network of cities within countries. And then, I mean, if you plot the different markets within a country, you can very easily see which are the isolated markets, right? Like there are markets that are obviously isolated. I mean, taking the case that I know really well, Liberia, I know exactly which, like there's a big city very far away. I like from being there and even looking just at the map, you directly see that it's an isolated market. And that for sure, I mean, there's more work I could do to that extent, that's for sure. Thank you for the suggestion, yeah.
There's a question in the Q&A from Tillman. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask it live.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, cool. Yeah, so I was wondering that at around the same time, basically, that these movement restrictions were implemented in many places, you maybe despite or in anticipation of these restrictions, you saw people moving to their home area, so like often to the countryside. And that would mean perhaps that just the demand structure in both the like consumer markets in cities, but also in the areas of origin would shift. And that may, I guess, like that could drive price differences up or down, depending on whether a given area is an area of origin or destination.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So it's a very good point. In the kind of the continuation of this paper, and this I haven't presented today, I'm actually estimating pass-through rates before and after the COVID crisis. And to do that, I put market fixed effects exactly, and at the monthly level, exactly to capture what you're saying, right? So so in that sense, that will take care of it. But you're right that for the price differences, I need to think about how this will impact the calculations. That's a very good point.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Someone just put their hand up. I can't see who.
Very nice, I think.
Very nice. Yes. Do you want to go?
Yeah, sorry, it's more like a sort of a data suggestion. If you haven't probably known this or haven't looked at it already, it comes with its own biases for very obvious reasons. But like Facebook has like movement maps that are at the depending second or third administrative layer that won't work for all countries you have, but for some, if you can geocode the markets, you can easily map them to those movement maps.
Yeah,
comes with biases. Not all people, but for example, you will also then know these kinds of things. Exactly who went home, for example, which markets might have more people than before.
No, yeah, that's true. So I had this idea like 2 days ago. So
okay.
I didn't know about this data actually. Someone suggested it like, literally the day before yesterday. And it's true that, I definitely plan on doing that. I mean, either for showing that movements actually decreased and that it correlates well with price differences, right? Even before COVID. Or that these movements to the countryside don't change much. That's a very good point. Yes,
So I think we're just about out of time now. So thank you so much, Golvine, for presenting to us today. It's been really lovely having you, and thank you very much. And I also just want to mention now that next week we'll be continuing with our seminar. We can do virtual clapping for you as well. But next week we'll be continuing with our seminar series, and we have Morgan Hardy from New York University in Abu Dhabi, who's going to be presenting Gotta Have Money to Make Money, Bargaining Behavior and Financial Need of Micro Entrepreneurs. So please also join us next week, and thank you so much again, Golvine.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.